What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and as you could have guessed, today we're going to be talking about Kareem and Wilt Chamberlain, two of the greatest big men to ever play the game. And for this video today, we're going to be answering the question, who was better, Prime Kareem or Prime Wilt? Now before I get into this video, if you haven't already subscribed, make sure to do so, and if you could like this video, I'd greatly appreciate it. So with that being said, let's get into the video. So as you guys know, these two big men are two of the greatest all-around players in NBA history. They were dominant on both ends, highly skilled, and highly effective. And before we get into the direct comparison, I want to look at Kareem as well as Wilt individually. Now first up, we'll look at Kareem, who entered the NBA in 1970 and whose prime ended in 1986. And during this time, he really had two separate peaks, his first peak being for 8 years, from 1970 to 1978, and his second peak being from 79 to 86. And during that first stint, he was a much more athletic player, more physical, and overall had a bigger impact on both ends of the floor. Now in his second prime / peak, he was still very effective on both ends. He had lost a little bit athletically, but skill-wise he was sharp as ever, and he really refined those skills in the early to mid 80s. Now if you look at Kareem's stats overall during this 17-year period, he averaged 26.4 points per game, 12.1 boards, 4.0 assists, with 2.9 blocks on 56% shooting. And I also threw in some advanced stat numbers and how many times he led the NBA in each of those categories. And as you can tell, Kareem was very dominant from an all-around perspective, leading the NBA in 12 different categories throughout his prime. And also during this stretch, he's a 6-time MVP, winning 5 of those in 7 years. So definitely some great numbers and some great accomplishments, but where you really make your name is in the playoffs. And once again, Kareem in the playoffs was dominant as ever, averaging 27.3 points per game, 12.0 boards, 3.8 assists, 2.8 blocks on 54% shooting. And once again, the advanced stat categories are impressive, and also during this time, Kareem was a 2-time Finals MVP. So looking at these stats and the accolades Kareem during this stretch, definitely accomplished a lot and had an immense impact on the NBA as one of their premier players. So now after looking at Kareem, let's go over to Wilt Chamberlain and look at his prime from 1960 to 1971. And very similar to Kareem, Wilt had two separate primes / peaks. His first prime being 1960 to 1966. And at this point, Wilt was asked to do everything for his teams. He had to score at a very high clip, he had to rebound, pass, defend, and really carry his team in all aspects while playing 47 minutes per game. Now in his second prime, from 1967 to 1971, he took a step back and became more of a team player. And that was in part due to his age, but also Wilt was a much smarter player during his second prime. Now when you look at Wilt's overall prime, it's some pretty staggering numbers, averaging 33.1 points per game, 23.6 boards, 4.5 assists on 53% shooting, and 51% shooting from the line. And during this 12-year span, Wilt won 4 MVPs, led the NBA in scoring 7 times, and rebounds 9 times, also while being pretty dominant in the advanced stat categories, very similar to Kareem. Now unfortunately for Wilt, the box plus minus stats do not go back that far, so we don't have access to those numbers. But I would take a pretty wild guess and say Wilt was also dominant in those stat categories. Now when talking about prime Wilt, like I said, he had to do everything for his teams early on, but later on, he was a much better team player. And I think that reflects in his playoff stats, as he averaged 25.1 points per game, 25.1 boards, 4.4 assists, while shooting 51% from the field and 46% from the line. And I put an asterisk next to the MVP column because when Wilt won his championship with the Warriors, the Finals MVP had not been invented yet. And once again, the box plus minus stats are not available for the playoffs, but I think it's safe to say Wilt would also dominate those stats. So that right there was the summary of Prime Wilt as well as Prime Kareem, how much they accomplished, and how well they played in the playoffs as well as the regular season. Now we get down to the fun part where we compare the two and see who had the better overall prime. And I sort of lied by saying that, as there is one more thing we have to do in evaluating these players. As with any player comparison video, you have to compare eras and you have to understand the difference between two eras. Now Wilt and Kareem roughly played in the same time period, but their primes only briefly overlapped. And I think when looking at both these players' eras, you can critique both of them pretty fairly. Now the first thing I'll say about Wilt's era is that his era stats-wise was very inflated. And before you go crazy, I'm going to prove it to you right now. If you look at NBA history, the top 15 highest scoring years of all time, that takes into account every single team in the league and their average points per game. The top 15 highest scoring years of all time, Wilt Chamberlain has 11 years in the top 15, and for the top 10, his era has every single year. So understand at this point, Wilt was playing the highest paced era of all time, the highest scoring era, and defense at this time, while there was good defenders, there wasn't necessarily good overall defense. And also the same thing can be said for the rebounding numbers, as once again they are very inflated. And when you look at the top 15, 10 of Wilt's prime seasons were in the top 15 for the most inflated rebound years. And even going further than that, looking at field goal attempts, Wilt has 13 of the 15 highest years ever, and also for free throws, Wilt's era has 9 of the top 15. So in a very general sense, Wilt's era, stats-wise, definitely has a curve when you look at it historically. Now when looking at Kareem, his era also wasn't perfect. He played during a time when the ABA was also in existence, and they had some of the premier players in that league. And you could very well argue the 70s was the weakest era of basketball in NBA history. So with both those disclaimers out of the way, now let's finally compare these two players and their overall production when it comes to the playoffs. And I want to compare the playoffs because that's where it matters most. So look at Kareem's numbers. He averages 27.3 points per game, 12.0 boards, 3.8 assists on 54% shooting. Wilt averages 25 and 25, 4.4 assists on 51% shooting from the field and 46% shooting from the line. And it's a pretty even comparison when you take into account eras, but where I think Kareem has the edge is how well he performed in relation to the regular season. Kareem in his prime had virtually no drop-off. You can see in the left column Kareem was marginally better and marginally worse in some categories, but there was no drastic drop-off. As for Wilt, that's a different story. His points per game average goes down by 8 points, and his free throw shooting goes down by 5.4%. Definitely a huge drop-off come playoff time. And also one very important thing is you have to look at how these players played in the NBA Finals, who rose to the occasion on the biggest stage. And Kareem during this stretch played 7 times in the Finals compared to Wilt, who played 4 times. And when you look at their numbers, Kareem averaged 27 and 10 with 4 assists on 54% shooting. Wilt averaged 19.9 points per game, 26.1 boards, 4.0 assists on 55% shooting from the field and 35% shooting from the line. So looking at these raw stats, Kareem definitely has the edge over Wilt when it comes to finals play. And I think it's even more obvious when we look at the drop-off from postseason play to the NBA Finals, as once again Kareem has marginal drop-offs, and there's really no major difference between his play in the postseason and his play in the finals. Now once again, Wilt has a huge drop-off, going down by 5.2 points per game, and an astounding 10.8% from the line. So when it comes to playoff performance as well as finals performance, and sustaining that level of play throughout the year, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar definitely has the edge over one Wilt Chamberlain. Now that right there was definitely a big plus for Kareem, but overall stats are not the only factor I have in this video. I also want to look at playoff competition and who faced the tougher teams. And how I determined this was by 3 main factors, that being net rating, SRS, and opponent's win percentage. All those combined are pretty good at deciding who faced the tougher competition. And when you look at the numbers, once again, it's a very impressive showing by both players. Kareem's opponents had the higher net rating, Wilt's opponents had the higher SRS. Kareem's opponents had a higher win percentage, and on average, he played more 50-win teams as well as more 55-win teams. So in this category for overall playoff competition, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar once again takes the victory. Now also, I want to narrow the scope and look at finals competition using those same 3 main factors. And this time, Wilt Chamberlain has the edge over Kareem, as he has the higher net rating as well as the higher SRS, 2 of the better advanced stat categories for playoff competition. And one thing you have to do when evaluating competition is take into account teammate help. Now both these players had some very good teammates, but Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had more help than Wilt Chamberlain, as Kareem played with Magic, Oscar, James Worthy, Bob Dandridge, Jamal Wilkes, Norm Nixon, as well as Michael Cooper. I mean, it's a stacked lineup of teammate help, and that's definitely a big reason Kareem won so many championships. Now, Wilt in his own right played with some very good talent. He had Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, Hal Greer, Billy Cunningham, Chet Walker, Paul Arzon. All those guys are Hall of Famers, but Wilt didn't play with those guys nearly as long, and when it comes to Jerry West and Elgin Baylor, they were on the back 9 of their careers when Wilt finally came to their team. So when it comes to the competition, relative to teammate help, I give Wilt Chamberlain the slight edge over Kareem. And one big critique I see with prime Kareem is that he had a brief 5-year stretch where he was without a Hall of Fame point guard in Oscar Robertson as well as Magic. And during these 5 years, it was pretty rough. He missed the playoffs twice, He lost in the first round one time, the second round one time, and the Western Conference Finals also one time. And it wasn't like he was playing with bad teams during that stretch. He had some good talent on those Lakers teams, but like I said before, without a Hall of Fame point guard, Kareem didn't accomplish much. Now, me saying that is not as big a knock on Kareem as you would think, as in my personal opinion, if I had a championship caliber team already established, I would take Kareem Abdul-Jabbar over Wilt Chamberlain. I think Kareem was a better team player, he was the smarter player, and he understood how to adapt to team offenses. Now on the flip side, if I had a bad roster, I would want Wilt Chamberlain carrying my team, as Wilt can do everything on the court. He can pass, he can score, he can rebound, and more importantly, he can defend and lock down their best player. And that right there is the beauty of both these players. They're different, but they're both extremely dominant and great in their own ways. So right now, we get to the best part of the video. We decide who is better, Prime Wilt or Prime Kareem. And when push comes to shove, the overall body of work, who was the better overall player in their prime, I'm going with Prime Kareem over Prime Wilt. And why I gave Kareem the edge is when you look at his playoff numbers and his overall dominance in the playoffs, he actually got marginally better the deeper he went compared to Wilt, who got substantially worse. That is one of the big things I look for in these comparisons: who gets better or who stays the same, and who gets worse the deeper you go in the playoffs. And also when we look at the competition, I gave Wilt the edge, but that edge was not nearly big enough to make up for the gap in the postseason play. And when looking at these players individually, like I said before, Wilt Chamberlain, you could argue was the better all-around player, but Kareem had the deadly sky hook, could lock down anyone on the block, and when it came to post-up play, there was nobody better than one Kareem. And overall, I think Kareem was the better player and could fit in more offenses and have a bigger impact on both ends. Now, one thing in this video I've barely touched on, and that's been intentional, is championships and overall winning, and which of these players had the bigger impact on winning. And when it comes down to it, winning does matter in team sports. I know a lot of modern day fans try to say it doesn't, but at the end of the day, when you have a player leading a team to championships as the best player, that definitely matters when evaluating who's better in their prime. And as you guys know, Kareem, during this 17-year stretch, won 4 championships and made it to 7 finals, opposed to Wilt, who only made 4 finals and won 1 championship. And also, I want you to remember how much better Kareem was in the finals compared to Wilt, and how little Kareem dropped off from his playoff play compared to his finals play, another big plus in Kareem's favor. And the last thing I'll say about Kareem is that later on in his career, he was a much more skilled player. His skyhook was always deadly, but later on he refined his move and became more of a grounded player and dominated purely off skill, opposed to Wilt for the most part, who dominated off physical force. And once Wilt declined, it was a very steep drop-off, opposed to Kareem, who had a gradual decline due to him being more skilled. So this is my final conclusion, that Prime Kareem was better than Prime Wilt. Kareem's prime was longer, he was better in the playoffs, better in the finals. Individually, he was more accomplished. Team-wise, he won more championships. And overall, he had a bigger impact on winning while being the more skilled player. So that is the end of the video. As always, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you guys next time.